The story begins with the employer carefully going through the protagonist's documents. After reviewing everything thoroughly, he tells the young man that, unfortunately, he can't offer him a position at the moment. However, he explains that if something opens up in the future, Han might have a shot at getting hired. The employer mentions that Han came to the right place, since he's an old friend of Mr. Du. He promises Han that if a position becomes available, they'll get in touch right away. Before wrapping up the conversation, the employer asks Han to leave, saying he still has other matters to attend to. The secretary then asks Han to call a cab for her. Han stands up, politely thanks the woman, and heads toward the exit. As Han walks away, the employer tells the secretary that the young man went to the same school as him and Mr. Du. He also brings up that Han's ex-girlfriend had stolen all his money, which seemed to have left the guy even more shaken up. While getting up, Han hears everything. The employer sounds annoyed by Han's boldness in asking Mr. Du for help finding a job. Deep in thought, Han realizes he just lost his last chance. A little while later, he arrives at the subway station entrance. Walking slowly, he reflects on his life and thinks about how he already saw himself as a seasoned loser. He goes through the turnstile and heads to the platform where the train would arrive. While waiting, Han stays lost in thought, convincing himself that his life was truly a mess, with no signs of success anywhere. As he gets closer to the platform edge, he stops and watches the train approaching from a distance. That's when he decides he's going down to the tracks. The train is speeding toward him. Han just stands there, waiting for it to take him away once and for all. The train gets closer and closer, and he feels like his useless life is about to come to an end. The train operator, seeing what's happening, tries to slow down. Suddenly, a loud screech fills the air, the sound of the train slamming on the brakes. Startled, Han realizes everything around him is going dark. He looks around, confused by what's going on. He wonders if maybe the subway lights just went out all of a sudden. At the same time, Han starts to notice something strange. People were disappearing, vanishing without a trace. He hears a weird sound, something like a sonar coming from nearby. Curious, Han turns around and sees a bright light shining next to him. Suddenly, a message appears right in front of him. A system voice announces that a starter gift package is now available. A beam of light shoots out near the subway car. Right after, the system tells Han that, thanks to the consumer's accumulated value, he's eligible to make a wish. It also instructs him to make a choice. Shocked, Han glances to the side, clearly mesmerized by what's happening. He realizes that if all of this is real, then maybe, just maybe, he finally has a shot at turning his life around. Without hesitation, Han decides he wants to go back to the past. With determination, he hits the confirm button on the system. He's made up his mind. This time, he's going to succeed. Filled with a mix of anxiety and excitement, Han covers his face with one hand, trying to contain the storm of emotions inside him. But even with all this happening, he's still standing right there, in front of the train at the subway station. The wheels of the train keep screeching as it fights to stop. For a second, Han really thinks the train is going to hit him, but suddenly he feels alive. The sound of the train is still roaring next to him. Han quickly turns and looks around, wide-eyed, full of energy and curiosity. That's when he realizes he's now inside the train, which is racing down a road in the middle of the night. Looking out the window, Han notices the details of the nighttime landscape flying by. Then, his eyes fix on the glass, and he stares at his own reflection. He's shocked to see that he looks younger. He touches his face with his fingers, just to be sure. And yes, it's real. He really is younger. The shock hits him hard. It's almost impossible to believe, but somehow he's actually moving through time. While trying to take it all in, Han suddenly notices a very beautiful girl sitting at the table next to him. He watched her closely. The girl was listening to music and calmly looking out the window. To Han, she gave off a familiar feeling, like someone important from his past. As soon as he recognized her, Han knew he had to go over and talk to her. That's when he noticed they were passing by a school he knew all too well, the well-known Shenzhen F School. Han sat down across from the girl, determined to start a conversation. Noticing him approach, the girl smiled politely and asked if he wanted to say something. With a soft smile, Han asked where she was headed. Even now, he still couldn't understand why this beautiful girl from his school was right there in front of him, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was hard to believe this was really happening. Then, a memory hit him, clear and sharp. He remembered a tragic day burned into his mind. That day in August, back in the year 2000. Trying to hide his shock, Han kept talking to the girl, still smiling. But he genuinely couldn't remember this moment ever happening. Faye looked at him thoughtfully and mentioned that they went to the same school. Han, curious, asked if she had ever been inside the school building. He added that she had taken the wrong path. Looking slightly worried, the girl asked if the train wasn't headed for Janjin. Han stayed quiet for a moment. That's when he realized he had said something that didn't make much sense to her. He quickly tried to explain himself. Han told her what he really meant. She should follow her own heart. He was completely captivated by her. He truly believed that this meeting between them was meant to happen. Then Faye pulled out her phone and called a friend named Pan Xiaoan, asking for his help. A short while later, the guy showed up and looked at Han with clear disgust. Pan stared at him with hate in his eyes and, with no patience, told Han to back off. Han stayed seated, silent, feeling how hard it was to face this part of his past again. He picked up a food container from the table, still confused about why things had to be like this. Then he stood up. He remembered eating instant noodles not long before. Looking at Pan, Han told himself that this time he'd handle things differently. He walked down the aisle with the food in his hand, a calm and determined look on his face. He was sure of one thing. This time, he wasn't going to start a fight. He walked over to the hot water dispenser and poured the water into his cup of noodles. As he prepared his meal, the system announced that the wish function had ended. Right then, Han received a new notification. The consumption system was now officially active. A window popped up showing all the features now available to him. As he stared down at his noodle cup, Han couldn't quite understand what the system meant by those options. He read through the messages carefully, trying to make sense of it all. He thought to himself that he was already getting tired of one of the seasoning packets. The system then explained that through consumption, he could gain experience, and that experience could be used to improve his skills and attributes. Han studied everything closely, but didn't understand why he had two different drives with different levels. He kept reading, still unsure of what path the system was trying to lead him toward. Then Han stretched out his hands in front of him, deciding right then and there that he wanted to level his abilities up to 5. He realized that if he reached that point, he'd be at the top. Before, he was just another ordinary guy, a forgettable gray mouse. But now, he had made his decision. He was going to rise above everyone else and become a new god. As he stood near the hot water machine with his arms outstretched, another customer walked in and asked him something. Han wrapped up his train of thought and continued on, carrying his food in his hands, fully aware that before anything else, he had to figure out how to make money. Meanwhile, Pang told the girl he wanted to take her to the dining car. Xiao, the friend, casually replied that she already had noodles with her. Han chimed in, saying that the girl's aunt used to scold him for eating stuff like that. She would always yell at him, annoyed, telling him not to worry about her anymore. At that moment, Han sat down and placed his cup of noodles on the table. Pang glanced to the side, visibly bothered by the fact that Han was laughing about something. Han explained that, when they were kids, he and the girl had been in love, and that's why he still cared about her in a special way. Faye looked over at her friend and said she wanted to eat exactly what the girl liked. The girl stood up and said she was heading to the dining car to grab some snacks. While she was gone, Han kept eating his noodles. A few minutes later, the girl came back with an orange and a small bag of food. Faye complained that they had already bought up almost all the food available. Han kindly offered her some of the chicken drumsticks he had bought. Faye was touched by the gesture and told him she'd pay him back for the chicken. Han explained that his meal had cost 2.5 yuan. The girl, a little embarrassed, admitted she didn't have any money on her. So Han asked her to try and find 3 yuan. With a satisfied smile, he told her that in exchange, he'd give her half of the orange, and they could share the food like good friends. The girl looked to Han warmly and told him he was really thoughtful. Han wished her a good meal, and in that moment, he noticed the beautiful smile on her face. That's when Pang came running over, holding a thick wad of cash in his hands. Excited, he shouted to the girl that he was willing to buy out the entire dining car for her. But Faye, ignoring Pang completely, chose instead to stay and enjoy the simple leftovers of Han's meal. Clearly disappointed, Faye asked Pang not to be so rude. Pang snapped at Han, outraged, yelling that Han was sitting there eating a duck leg out of a plastic bag, but had refused to go to the dining car with him. Faye stayed by the table and, growing impatient, called Pang by his full name. She then asked him if he had ever thought about how she felt. Han stayed quiet, just watching. Faye told Pang that the two of them just weren't a match and demanded that he stay away from her. Angry, Pang asked where she was going. Faye calmly replied that she was just going to throw out the trash. Pang was furious. He glanced over and saw Han. Blinded by rage, he rushed at Han, grabbed him by the collar, and, without hesitation, threw him violently to the side. Han hit the ground hard, completely losing it. Pang blamed Han for everything. He turned and kicked him with all his strength, screaming that Han needed to give up, to stop trying. As Han started to get up, he noticed a small drop of blood next to him. He realized that, in this 18-year-old body, he was still physically weak, but he was determined. He stood up and turned his head toward Pan Shao. In his mind, he told himself that he still had to chase after his pot of gold, that goal he'd had in his heart since the very beginning. The train sped through the night, heading toward a tunnel. Inside the train, Han now lay unconscious on a luggage rack. Worried, the girl turned to a man nearby and asked about Han's condition. The man shined a flashlight on him and said that the student wasn't responding. Han was in a deep coma. The man looked more closely into the boy's eyes and commented that Han had probably suffered a head injury. Another passenger, a stranger, suggested that Han needed to be taken to the nearest hospital immediately. Han remained unconscious, completely unaware of how worried the people around him were. He was slumped on the floor of the train car, passed out. Still, Pan shouted cruelly that Han was just faking it. Even in his unconscious state, Han seemed to recoil from his opponent, as if deep down he already knew what kind of monster Pan truly was. In his past life, he had faced that very same person. Back then, he'd only managed to survive thanks to Kolax. Yet now, Pan grabbed him by the shirt, furious, and asked with disgust what he had just said. Han looked at him with rage in his eyes and, defiant, asked how much he'd enjoyed hearing those words. Consumed by fury, Pan raised his hand, ready to strike. Han muttered that without Kolax's help, he probably wouldn't have made it out. He stared at Pan, unwavering, and admitted that, despite everything, he was grateful. Pan scoffed, called him an idiot, and raised his fist again. This time, he hit Han hard, throwing him to the side. The people around them gasped in horror. One passenger, nervous and on edge, shouted that he'd call the police. Pan, still raging, screamed that he was going to beat Han to death. Fear spread through the car. A man rushed forward and placed himself between Pan and Han, trying to shield the boy. That's when Faye came running, shouting Pan's name in a stern voice. The terrified young man tried to explain himself, begging her to listen, but he still held on to Han's shirt tightly. Once again, he called Han an idiot. Han, beaten and bloodied, gave a faint smile through the pain. He looked Pan straight in the eyes and, in a low voice, barely more than a whisper, called him a loser. Faye couldn't take it anymore. She shoved Pan away forcefully, her eyes filled with worry for Han. She rushed to the protagonist's side and examined him, clearly panicked. She shouted to the other passengers, begging for a doctor. Several people nodded, agreeing he really needed help. With the last of his strength, Han raised a trembling hand and tried to reassure her. "I'm fine," he whispered. Then he passed out cold on the floor. Faye sat beside him, terrified, not knowing what to do. She screamed again, desperately calling for a doctor. A short while later, a police officer entered the train car. Pan tried to defend himself, telling the officer that Han had started the fight. But one of the passengers stepped forward and firmly declared that Pan was lying, because he had seen everything with his own eyes. One of the witnesses explained that when the girl stepped out to throw away the trash, Pan just rushed in and attacked Han out of nowhere. Other passengers added that the protagonist didn't even try to fight back. Watching all of this unfold, Faye couldn't help but blame herself. Deep down, she believed Han had gotten hurt because of her. He shouldn't have gotten involved, she thought to herself. Meanwhile, Pan was still trying to justify himself to the officer, claiming Han had mocked him. But the cop wasn't buying it. He firmly warned Pan that he should have thought about the consequences before throwing a punch. If something serious had happened to Han, Pan would have been held fully responsible. The officer made it clear, if necessary, Pan would go to jail for breaking the law. The threat clearly shook him. Pan rushed over to Faye, begging her to say something, anything, in his defense. But she just stared at him in silence, disappointed. She didn't want to take sides. Pan, now frantic, pulled out his phone and dialed Pang, hoping maybe his family could clean up the mess. On the other end, Pang answered, confused, and asked what was going on. Wanted to know if Pan was with someone named Janj. Pan, barely holding it together, asked for help in a voice that sounded more like a prayer than a plea. All around them, passengers watched the scene unfold, stunned. Han, still hurting, was being gently cared for by Faye, who did everything she could to help him. She held his hand softly, stroking it, and asked if it hurt. Han stayed quiet, trying to bear the pain. He was clearly shaken. Blood was dripping from his nose. Faye, visibly worried, asked if he was all right. Han nodded and told her he was fine, trying to ease her mind. He glanced at her, just briefly, but in that moment, she looked like a goddess to him. Faye sighed and told him he'd really scared her back there, but promised she'd take him straight to the hospital once they reached the next station. Han smiled and said again that he'd be okay. Then Faye, a little ticked off, muttered, "Well, Pan's gonna be chewing with whatever teeth he's got left." Han remembered that, in his past life, even a small hit to the head would have knocked him out cold. He looked over at Pan, who was still on the phone, probably begging the Pangs to fix things for him. Han thought about calling him out, but decided against it. He sat there on the train bunk, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. He figured he should tell Faye more about the kind of person Pan really was. With a grin, Han said he needed to keep an eye on Pan so he could explain everything later. The train sped out of the tunnel, racing toward the next station. Faye sat nearby, clearly upset. She couldn't believe Pan had the nerve to attack someone he barely even knew. Lost in thought, she wondered what she'd do if something even worse happened. As the train came to a stop, Han got ready to step off, carefully opening the door. Faye stared at him, worried. She gently held his arm and, with a warm smile, told him to be careful and not fall. Then, Han suddenly pulled her into a hug. He told her she was unbelievably beautiful and kind, and added that, to him, she was the goddess of the second high school. Surprised, Faye asked, "Wait, do you actually go to second high?" She said his face looked really familiar. Han sat down on the floor, smiling warmly. "Well, it's a great honor to be remembered by you," he replied. Faye reached out and helped him to his feet. "You're still as reckless as ever," she said, shaking her head. Han's tone turned serious. "From now on, I really need to focus on my training." He clenched his fist tightly. "I have to get stronger, strong enough to protect the girl standing next to me." Then, almost proudly, he touched his own arm and muttered with a grin, "Yeah, I'm kind of cool guy." Faye smiled and teased, "You should probably focus on protecting yourself first. You're still all banged up." The train finally rolled into the station. Waiting on the platform, police officers immediately stepped forward and arrested Pan Xiao, placing handcuffs on him without hesitation. Han headed straight to the hospital, silently wondering if this whole mess would finally change Pan for the better. At the hospital, Han lay in a clean infirmary bed. He blinked, confused, and asked the nurse, "Wait, is this heaven?" The woman chuckled kindly and explained that he'd been placed in a special care room. Top medication, best treatment, and all the rest he needed. Han gave her a wide, grateful smile. "You're amazing," he said sincerely. Not long after, a message from the system popped up. Han had just earned 20,000 experience points. He froze in disbelief. That was a lot. Lying there, Han realized that even the cost of his treatment had somehow been converted into system points. Content. He started scrolling through the system interface, eyes gleaming with excitement. Just then, the door creaked open, and Faye walked in, holding a bouquet of flowers. Han stared, caught off guard. She smiled and asked, "How are you feeling?" Han looked away, flustered, his ears slightly red. "Hey, about those little favors we did for each other, maybe we should call it even?" He was visibly embarrassed. Faye tilted her head, playful. "In that case, I'll start calling you Mr. Cool Guy from now on." Han grumbled, "You're totally messing with me." But Faye only laughed and held out her hand, returning the glasses she'd brought for him. Han turned his head and looked at her closely. After putting his glasses back on, he thought to himself that, in a normal life, someone like him probably wouldn't even get the chance to talk to a girl this beautiful. He recalled hearing that Faye's family was planning a huge wedding. As he watched her gently from the side, something about her felt quietly enchanting. Faye began wiping an apple clean with care. Han found the gesture incredibly sweet. It spoke volumes about her kind heart. "My Pang will be here soon," Faye said softly with a light smile. "How about we exchange contacts?" She asked if he used any messaging apps. Han smiled back and nodded, "Yeah, I do." She quickly added him, and Han confirmed, just sent the request. At that moment, a small group walked into the room, led by the nurse. Faye lit up and ran straight into the arms of her Pang, who looked at her, worried. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Meanwhile, Han remained seated on the hospital bed when he noticed a man standing nearby. He looked a bit older, with a receding hairline, and carried himself with quiet dignity. The man gave a respectful bow. "I'm Pan Xiao Han's Pang," he said, his voice heavy with remorse. I'm truly sorry for not raising my son better. Han blinked, surprised. The man lowered his head further. I sincerely apologize for what happened. But Han, not one to hold a grudge, gently replied. You don't have to apologize. Really. He tried to stand, intending to show his respect and close the conversation on equal footing. But as soon as he moved, a sharp pain shot through his leg. He wobbled and nearly collapsed. Stop! Don't move! The man cried out, panic in his voice. You're seriously injured. You could make it worse. A woman standing beside him, presumably Mrs. Pan, spoke up. Apologies are the least we can offer. We spoiled our son far too much. Han, try to ease the tension, said with calm honesty. The fight was partly my fault too. When Pan started hitting me, I called him a loser. He didn't want to paint himself as a helpless victim. But the man wouldn't accept that. No, this was entirely my son's doing. He insisted firmly. We want to make it right. He looked Han directly in the eyes and said plainly, we're prepared to offer compensation. A brief silence passed. Then, how about 800,000? Han froze, stunned. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. 800,000? The number echoed in his head over and over. His thoughts began racing. What could I do with that kind of money? Before he could respond, the man added, if it's not enough, we can offer more. Han quickly waved his hands in the air politely. No, this is already more than generous, he said, trying to collect himself. He remembered something Fei had mentioned. That Pan's Pang was an intelligent and strategic man. The older man stood there, clearly anxious, waiting for Han's answer. Han finally spoke up, his voice steady but sincere. If you're offering money to make this right, it shows you're a responsible Pang. But what matters most is that your son understand how serious this is. That this kind of behavior could destroy his life. The man listened closely. His expression was serious, thoughtful. He nodded slowly. You're absolutely right, he replied. He bowed again, deeply. I promise I'll teach him properly. This will never happen again. Han looked him in the eye. I don't need the money, he said. What really matters is that Pan realizes the consequences of his actions. Not just for himself, but for his entire family. He paused. Your sincerity convinced me. Let's settle this the right way. Relieved, the man stepped forward and shook Han's hand tightly. I'll take Pan home. He will change. I swear it. His wife gently tugged at his sleeve and said softly, it's time to go. Han Lin needs to rest. The man gave her a nod, then looked at Han one last time. Rest well and take a long, peaceful bath, he said with a smile, giving a respectful wave as he walked toward the door. Fei walked quietly down the hallway alongside her Pang, the air between them tense, like a hot pan waiting to hiss. Suddenly, the elder Mr. Pan turned and grabbed Mr. Jin's hand. I'm truly sorry for all the trouble my son has caused, he said, his voice low and earnest. I hope this won't damage the relationship between our families. Chen Jin gave a soft smile and nodded in silence. But deep down, one thought echoed in his mind. If that boy ever causes trouble again, I'll deal with it myself. Fei's Pang told a friend he could handle his own business, while Mr. Pan replied that he had some documents to take care of. He promised to get in touch with his daughter once everything was settled. Walking quietly through the hospital corridor, Fei and her Pang headed toward the exit. The Pang glanced at her with a serious look and asked, what's going on? Fei's voice was calm but firm. That Pan Shaoan kid is acting really strange. They stepped outside onto the street. The man turned to his companion and said softly, that Pan won't bother you anymore. He also mentioned it felt odd that Fei's mother had asked that boy to watch over her during the trip. Fei replied without hesitation. If Pan were more mature, less reckless like Han, none of this would have happened. Her Pang smiled and said, I get along pretty well with that Han. He looked at his daughter and asked with a hint of surprise, you really only know him from today? Fei laughed. We go to the same school. And besides, he's already taken hits because of me. She glanced at her Pang and teased. So what do you think of Can? The man smiled and answered thoughtfully. He seems mature and sensible. Fei pressed for a more detailed answer, and he explained, at your age, not many kids are as mature as he is. She nodded and said, a man's character is often shaped by life circumstances. Her Pang agreed, adding, your boyfriend's success might even surpass personal feelings. He looked at her with pride. He's truly a special young man.